Welcome back once more. GP Xavier, round number three, I think. Part two of this discussion at least. Good to have you back.
Thank you, Lucas.
So we left off last episode, if I remember correctly, talking about the supernatural, the possibility of the supernatural. I think it was quite short that we discussed it, so we can just we don't have to repeat what we said because I don't even remember what I said. But maybe you can just briefly talk a bit about what you mean by the supernatural, if you're able to, and I'll respond
Mm,
and I'll say my thoughts about it if I think it's something that happens, and yeah, we'll take it from
yeah, I think part of it was sort of figuring out what the term actually means.
there.
Uh, but I guess its rough and ready kind of common meaning is, let's say, based on our current understanding of science, things that happen that shouldn't be able to happen. So, you know, there's that covers a huge range of things. Um, things like maybe life after death, like reading people's minds, um, moving objects with one's mind. I would also include synchronicities in that as well.
Yeah,
So coincidences, meaningful coincidences that are so overwhelmingly unlikely that it begs the question of, is there something behind this? Ghosts, I guess. Anything like that that sort of is outside the current scientific paradigm.
yeah,
Although I would say the current scientific paradigm is more expansive than most people assume. Just considering that, quantum physics is a thing.
yeah,
The boundaries I don't think are as rigid and clear as people imagine. The reason that we were sort of struggling to define it, or at least I was struggling to define the paranormal, is that if these events we call paranormal have some sort of law behind them, and if they fit into nature as a whole, then one can expand one's definition of nature. One can expand one's definition of normal, I guess, and it would be included within that. So let's say, for instance, that there is some way that let's say I can read your mind in some sense. I can know immediately what you're thinking. Let's say that that is one possible phenomenon and that it has some kind of explanation. Um, don't know what that exactly would look like, but let's say that it's got an explanation. It's not just random. So in that case, you could just say that that's just natural too, like everything is natural. And that's where I think the question of the supernatural, like what remains supernatural. Um, One final thought, I guess, on that could be the supernatural is what supernatural entities or beings willingly create or do. Um, Now, that could include just regular people. So that would, in a sense, be a quite an expanded sense of the supernatural. That would be basically assuming that free will exists.
hmm
And so I guess I would include supernatural beings as being like us as well, because we would be above and beyond just natural phenomena. Um, so that would be one definition, because it's not, if free will truly exists, then I would say it's outside of like the causal chain. It's not defined or determined by laws.
yeah,
Um, so why is all of this interesting? I think it's interesting to think about whether these phenomena occur, because I mean, that's just amazing if they do.
yeah,
I think, I think, I think it's probable, I won't say I'm sure, but I think it's probable that stuff like this does happen. And then the second question is, I guess, how does that fit with a naturalist philosophy? Because we were talking about John Vervaeke's approach. Um, and what was the term that he used? something physicalist,
non-reductive
non
physicalist.
non-reductive physicalism.
Yeah.
Yes. And I've also heard him refer to himself as a naturalist
Mm.
in that same sense, as a non-reductive,
Yeah.
not a reductive materialist. And so the question would be, could these kind of events fit in with that framework? And also maybe, I guess, just for fun, does John Vervaeke believe in these events? I get the
Yes.
feeling no, but that's just me.
Yeah. Okay, that's great. I'll start right off with where you ended on with Vervaeke, and that is that
Mhm.
um, he has spoken before about how what often seems like something supernatural could be a higher level of in like intuition. Um, like especially in ancient times, a lot of people thought there were magicians. That was very normal
Mhm.
to speak about people that could manipulate in some sort reality or could see things that we can't. And this is something we spoke about at the end of the episode last time. Um, I think he would say that a lot of what we experience as maybe that's supernatural, it's just a very heightened level of maybe intuition isn't even the right word, but maybe similar to a shaman, what a shaman can see. But yeah, that's just
Yeah,
one part of it.
so it would to summarize that is that essentially we're talking about like pattern recognition, like kind of
Yeah.
unconscious pattern recognition. It's nothing above and beyond what we already know about the world, basically.
In a sense, yes, but I think people that see patterns do see things that are beyond what at least normal people see
Yes,
of the world,
in
if you
that
know what I
sense.
mean.
Yeah, yeah.
So, so yeah, but
I want you to continue, so don't lose your thought. But it just occurred to me, I watched a talk about him, talk with him recently. I forget which one it was, but he often brings up the example of the Mars rover. And he talks about how the people operating the Mars rover kind of embody the Mars rover. They sort of feel at one with the Mars rover in some sense.
yeah,
Um, and how one of the women who was operating it was gardening, and she sort of intuited or felt like a particular, I think it was a particular part of the Mars rover wasn't working properly or was stuck or something like that. And then she went into the control center or the lab or whatever it is and found out that that was actually true. Like it actually has happened.
yeah,
Um, so that might be a classic example of this. I guess if our interpretation of Vervaeke is correct, he would say that she's become so familiar with the Mars rover that on some unconscious level, she kind of predicted this would happen,
yeah,
or she kind of knew that it would happen without consciously knowing it and when it would happen.
yeah,
It's possible. It's possible. It still seems extremely unlikely, though, and I don't know the specific circumstances around that event, but it seems incredibly unlikely that would happen. But who knows?
yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's quite an extreme example. Like, do you have to have crazy levels of that subconscious ability? But I know, like, I'm reading right now McGilchrist's Matter with Things, and he pulls up an
Brilliant
example.
book.
You've read it?
Yes, yes.
How
How
did you
far
do
through are
that?
you?
It's like, what is it? I think it's like, what is it, 2,000 words or something, if not more? Sorry,
Yeah,
2,000.
two big volumes. Amazing book, though.
2,000
Absolutely,
pages.
like incredible.
Yeah, I'm like a third of the way through, but
Hmm.
it's really good. And he speaks about an example of a man who predicts horse races, and he gives
Hmm.
percentages to the horses of their odds of winning, basically. And he finds that he does so much better when he's relaxed and he doesn't really think
Hmm.
about it. He doesn't do a lot of
Hmm.
preparation. He just goes to the horse race and he watches them warm up and he sees how they
Hmm.
interact with the trainers. Um, and then they start to study him, and the more he has to like think about what he's doing, the worse he gets. Um, but that's just a classic example of how your intuition sometimes is much stronger than your, well, I don't know if reason is the right word, but you know what I mean, the
Well,
analytical part.
yes. it's the power of you could say it's the power of the right hemisphere versus the left hemisphere.
Yeah,
That's definitely McGilchrist's point. But I would still say there's two interpretations of this. One is that it is just that it's the right hemisphere is in a certain sense smarter, or it's smarter about certain things. It's better able to see patterns, let's say.
yeah,
That's one interpretation, but the other interpretation would be that the right hemisphere is actually more able to tune into these kind of psi phenomena or paranormal stuff. Um, this seems to be closer to Jung's interpretation, Carl Jung, because he really believed that synchronicity was something paranormal, basically, and that he was going to these places himself and with his patients that were very right hemisphere oriented in terms of exploring mythology and imagery and sort of dreams and things like that. Um, there's the famous example, I don't know if you've read much Jung or you know about this, but there's the famous example he brings up of the scarab beetle. A
yes,
woman, a patient of his, dreamt that she held a scarab beetle in her hand. And as she was relating the dream to him, a kind of golden colored beetle, it wasn't a true scarab beetle, but it was like kind of looked like that, started tapping on the window just as she was talking. And
yeah,
so he opened the window and picked it up and put it in her hand and said, "Here's your beetle." And
yeah,
that kind of affected a kind of cure. One wonders, one that doesn't seem so amenable to me to the kind of pattern recognition interpretation. It seems more like something deeper than that. But
yeah. Also
I
because of the
think
way it
mm,
manifests in reality.
exactly, exactly.
I did read quite a bit of Jung, and I also read Kastrup, who wrote a book called Decoding Jung's Metaphysics, and he actually personally had a similar experience, where he was. I'm not gonna be able to relate very well, but it was a specific rock that he found in a river, like a specific shape of rock. I think he may have been thinking about it for a while, and it was like so unlikely that it was there, and it just tapped his foot, and he got it there. And to him, it left no coincidence. So then the funny thing is with Aaron, um, I think I'll be able to speak about this. It's not very crazy, but he had a maybe some sort of a synchronicity as well, where he went to Austria, I think, um, wherever Nietzsche used to live, close to
Hmm.
there, and he did a walk there, and he was walking with Madeleine, his then girlfriend, now
Hmm.
fiance, and they saw this rock, and he was like, "Let me get a," or my Madeleine said it, to get a picture of him at the rock, and he got the picture, and then they went to what used to be Nietzsche's house, and there was a
Hmm.
picture of Nietzsche at that same rock, and it was like almost the same picture, it was really absurd.
Yeah, amazing. Yeah, and I've also had some striking synchronicities as well. I feel like most people have, or maybe I don't know if I can speak for most people, but a lot of people have really interesting stories to tell. If you sort of ask that question of, have you ever had like a really unlikely coincidence happen? And it does
Yeah,
make you wonder what's going on.
yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think it's also it's sometimes it's more little things, more subtle things. Like I don't think I've ever had a really obvious one. Like the young one is pretty wild, but like with the scarab beetle. But I think I've
Mm,
had like smaller ones, and it's something that Jung said as well about miracles, that they happen all the time, but you have to be aware of them. Um, and so I think reality is just laid out in a meaningful manner. Um, it's part of
mm,
the symbolism thing of Peugeot. Like symbolism
mm,
happens. Like
mm.
when you watch what was it, the Pope, and you had
Oh,
I don't know
the
if
the two birds,
yeah,
right?
with the two birds.
Yeah.
He lets the doves go, and there was a boy in blue or something, and a girl in red or something along those lines, and he lets the doves go, and what is it? One of the doves got caught by
A crow or something
yeah,
like that.
crow, and I'm
Yeah.
not sure, but it was like it was so obvious, and he was like, if someone had recorded this, like 100 years ago, like they
Yes.
spoke about this in history books, people would think, oh no, that didn't happen. That's just something they thought up. And now it's so
Yes.
obvious. It's out on YouTube. Like you can watch the video right now, and still people will wave it away as a coincidence.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, so things like that. things like that for sure. They persuade me into a direction. Um, but then more specifically on really mind reading, I kind of thought that that wasn't really a thing for a long time. Um, like I remember listening to Joe Rogan speaking to someone who was really convinced that these things happen,
Hmm.
and Joe was like, "Well, there's no scientific proof of it, and this and that." And I thought that was quite convincing because I was like, "Yeah, if people really do read minds, how hard is it to like record something like that?" Um, and so you're familiar with Wolfgang Smith?
Yes, a little bit.
So yeah, I did a series about him, and I listened to a lot of his work, and I read a lot of his books, and he's had
Hmm.
personal experiences where he would go to India, and upon arriving, he got a call from a friend saying that he would meet him the next day at 11, and he goes down in the hotel and he goes outside, and an Indian guy comes up to him, and he's like, you got good news, something good is happening tomorrow at 11. And then he stays with him, and then he guesses exactly the number that he's thinking of and all these things. And to him, that was like,
Mm-hmm.
that left no doubt. Like
Hmm.
that is absolutely some sort of form of mind reading. I wonder if there's a way to, like, when you watch a magician, just a modern magician, I mean, they do things with cards where I'm also like, I really can't explain this. But then
Hmm.
there's whole shows and whatnot that try to explain how they do that with certain visual things. I wonder how
Mm.
much that is explicable.
I think
So,
it's a really, yeah, absolutely. It's a really messy situation in a way because you do have people that can do magic tricks really, really well.
yeah,
And then you have maybe this other phenomenon, maybe that's going on, and they kind of mix together. So for instance, in like mediums or whatever, there's some well-documented cases of like fraud, like in sort of, mediums and seances and stuff, where they actually were just sort of like it was a trick, it was a setup.
yeah,
Um, and so it kind of comes and mingles in with that. But then you have other situations where you sort of like, well, how could this have been set up? How could this be a trick? Um, and I last time we talked, I mentioned in passing Dean Radin, who's a scientist. He does a lot of experiments with psi, with paranormal phenomena. And one of the ones that he's done, I'm pretty sure it was him who's done this, was he does a lot with random number generators. And so they're true, as far as I know, they're true random number generators. So I assume they're like triggered by radioactive decay or something genuinely random. And basically he puts a room full of people focusing on a particular number, and then statistically it becomes more probable, or it becomes more probable that that number will appear to a statistically significant degree, and it should be
yeah,
completely random. So it's like, what's going on there? It seems like there's no room for, you know, a trick.
yeah. It's fun. What do you mean radioactive decay? It's based on radioactive decay. I know this is a trivial part of what you just said, but it's still interesting.
I think this might be out of my depth, so I don't know if I can truly explain it, but I think the idea is that you've got sort of pseudo random number generators that are just sort of computers basically,
Yeah,
and they're just trying to be random, but they're never going to be truly random. And then you
yeah,
have like natural physical processes that are genuinely random. So
yeah,
the rate at which something decay, like a radioactive substance decays, is supposed to be truly random.
yeah.
So that's all that I know. I can't explain it beyond that. So
That's all good.
yeah.
I'll respond with an example of something that also doesn't seem random. That was one of my first like peeks into a possibility that there might be more, and that is when I first heard about DMT and people doing that at the same time. So dimethyltryptamine, psychedelic
Hmm.
substance,
Hmm.
and people experiencing the same thing, like at the
Hmm.
same time, taking the same
Hmm.
substance, as if they enter into another dimension. And then
Hmm.
my own experience with dimethyltryptamine in the form of ayahuasca was also to me at the time, and still looking back, there was no doubt about it for me that I was in contact with beings, like
Hmm.
not
Hmm.
human beings, not
Hmm.
animals, something on a higher level of ontology, some sorts, higher
Hmm.
level of being, um, higher ontological plane. And now they're doing experiments with a slow drip of dimethyltryptamine, and they're trying to prove that there is some sort of mapped dimension. Like they're trying to map the realm of some sort, if I remember correctly. And actually,
Wow.
I registered for this experiment, and I was
Uh-huh.
emailed about it a while back. But I don't think I was selected. At least they asked me to move on with the selection process anyway. I don't think it happened. Um, but they're working on that to do it, I think, in different locations at the same time to try to like get
To
interactions
map
going.
map the
Uh,
DMT realm. That
yeah,
is fascinating. That is fascinating. I wonder what will come of that.
yeah, me too. They're doing it in the UK, so if I get updates about it, I'll discuss it on the channel, and I put the link of it down below if I can find it, because I you could just register free a while back.
Hopefully the entities or the machine elves or whatever don't mind us mapping
Yeah, well,
out
it's
their
a funny
realm.
thing we speak about it, because if I would have heard this, let's say 4 years ago, how old am I? Yeah,
Hmm.
4 years ago, I would have been like, that's absolute nonsense. Um, but having firsthand experience, I think, so I still don't know, and I don't want to.
Hmm.
Like, I think it goes pretty south when you start to speak about a recollection of an experience. But yeah, for me, there's no doubt about it. And for most people that do this sort of thing, there's no doubt about that it's not a figment of your imagination. Like, it's clearly something you're
Hmm.
connecting to. Almost no
Hmm.
one disputes that. Um,
Hmm.
so yeah,
Yeah. I mean, if you have so Vervaeke has a leveled ontology, right? This is how he describes it, which I really like. So it's not just like the lowest level is the only real level and everything else is an illusion, right? It's not just like quarks and leptons right at the bottom are the only real things, and everything above that, atoms, molecules, human beings, are sort of nothing real in themselves, just a collection of these quarks. He thinks that every level is real. I would say to that, we don't, we haven't kind of found the top, we haven't found the top level, or, like it's somewhat unbounded. Um, who's to say there aren't other levels? And I guess he would say there are other levels above us because there's collective intelligence and so forth. But who's to say that there's not different forms of intelligences as well,
yeah,
like these kind of DMT intelligences,
yeah,
or different kind of realms like this DMT realm? Um, I think it's totally possible, and I think reality is just intensely psychedelic and strange. Just normal reality, right?
yeah,
Like I mentioned last time we talked, everyone is spiritual, everyone is religious. In the sense that, at least in the sense that everyone believes that they are a self that has continuity in time, that, is this thing. They have this conception of a self, right? And then they believe that all these other selves exist and that they can interact with them and they have their own private experiences and memories. And all of that is really crazy if everything is just made out of quarks and leptons.
yes,
Um,
yeah,
and it's a very specific worldview, and it's very psychedelic. Like, it's very psychedelic when you
mm,
think about it.
mm,
The world is just inhabited by all these consciousnesses, you know, bound to bodies or whatever.
yeah.
So why can't there be others?
No, exactly. It's kind of a, I don't know if I should say naive, but it's it's maybe even an arrogance to think that it ends with us. So we can see how it goes down. We see animals with, I think I can say, lower levels of intelligence in many ways. Of course, dogs can smell better than us, but I
Yeah.
think it's pretty fair. And then insects, and like you go down to cells, and to say that there's not levels above us, like there would be no way. Um, like to a dog, we are kind of like unimaginably smart in many ways. Like we can
Hmm.
provide a dog with so many things. We can finish a dog's life in seconds.
Hmm.
Um, Yeah, and I think looking up, it might be something similar. Like there might be beings that hold power over us, maybe in a loving relationship even. I mean, that's why I believe in a loving
Mm,
God, of course. It goes all the way up, but I really think there's things in between there.
yeah.
I
I
find it hard
guess
to imagine otherwise.
to play the devil's advocate a little bit, I guess the problem is with a dog versus a human. Yes, there's a radical difference in degree, but there's also a continuity. Like we're both animals,
Yeah,
and if a dog could do science, it would pretty easily, well, maybe not easily, but eventually it would understand how a human brain can function and why it's so much better, right? Because we're still talking about brains, we're still talking about
yeah,
nerves, we're talking about bodies, we're talking about the whole physical system. Where we're thinking of other intelligences that aren't physical, or at least, maybe live in a different realm with a different physics. I mean, we're not talking about human bodies. And so I think that's a legitimate hesitation that people
yeah.
have because we can
I agree.
understand that our thoughts are bound to our brain states. I'm not saying that they're the same. I'm just saying we notice a close association between the two.
Yeah,
If
measurable.
something doesn't have a brain, how does it have consciousness? How does it have thought, will, etc.? I think that would be the key issue.
Yeah.
Do you have a response to that, or how would you respond?
Well, I this is something I also discussed with Vervaeke about consciousness and brain death, for example.
Hmm.
Because he's quite adamant about, well, in the Awakening for the Meaning Crisis series, he's like quite adamant about there not being the life after death.
Yes.
But when I heard that the first time, it bothered me because I was like,
Hmm.
oh, I don't think it's true first. And I don't know if even it's scientific. And then I listened again, and I was like, let me just ask him about this because I got the opportunity to speak to him. And he didn't mean it in the way that I thought, which I think makes a lot of sense. Like, because I spoke about how Kastrup looks at it, um, and to him, scientifically, it's quite obvious even that there is life after death because he bases it on NDEs and yeah, people that have experiences beyond themselves that start to grasp a whole of some sort. But Vervaeke was very open to the possibility that death is sort of a merging with the one, and it's atemporal and it's beyond
Hmm.
space as well. That's what he was sympathetic toward. But consciousness in space and time without the brain, that seems to be very difficult.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
but then I think if you do go up a level, I don't think that that level is completely disconnected from us, the same way we're not disconnected from the quantum realm. Um,
Hmm.
so
Yes. Yeah.
I think it's impossible to have a consciousness that's only bound to space and time. Um, that doesn't have a brain. But I think when you go up, I think that's just laws we don't understand. Or if there's laws, that's just a reality we don't understand. So I think there's not much to say about it. But yeah,
Yes, and maybe the only way we could talk about it at all, or even think about it, would be through a direct experience or some kind of direct insight or intuition.
yeah,
Um, well, like you sort of kind of referred to when you're talking about DMT, because I haven't done DMT, so I've never encountered that realm. I have no conception of what that could actually be like, but you do. Um,
maybe.
so, so yeah, maybe. But that's through a direct experience that at least at least you have that experience. Whereas it's harder for me to conceptualize it. Um, I don't want to sort of go over what we talked about in our first talk too much. But I think when we're thinking about Kastrup versus Vervaeke, I've looked a little bit at Kastrup. Your Aaron actually asked me a question in a comment about what I thought about his view of the afterlife. So I had a little look at that. Um, so his conception, and correct me if I'm wrong, is basically that you wake up in a sense as the mind at large. You wake up as the only true consciousness. Is that a fair description?
Yeah, I think so. The thing with Kastrup is that he understands this, so he will say like death is simply going back to mind at large, but he
Hmm.
doesn't have any conception of what that actually looks like. Do you know what I
Okay.
mean?
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. So that.
Yeah. Okay. So then maybe it's a bit closer than I thought, because I think if we, and it could just be a purely a metaphor that he's using when he said, when he sort of says or implies that you kind of wake up, because that implies there's a temporal progression from um, where you are in life, and then you um, wake up as the whole mind. I think he does talk about you bringing your memories into it, so that actually,
Yeah.
like, enriching it with your memories, so that actually does imply that there's some sense of change and temporality in the absolute mind. um, but I think that, I don't know, it sounds a bit too anthropomorphic for me, I
Mm.
guess. And I think where Vervaeke is coming from and saying a very similar thing is still saying, I think he's still basically saying that for all intents and purposes, as far as we're concerned as individual beings, death is the end. That that reuniting with the one, to use that terminology, is basically equivalent to ceasing to exist as an individual being.
Yeah.
So I think those are compatible.
Yeah.
Um, and therefore, since I am an individual being, I actually care about that distinction, right? Like, it doesn't matter too much to me whether I cease to exist and become, in a sense, the absolute, or whether I cease to exist and become nothing. Qualitatively, those are the same experience for me.
Yes. And so what's interesting about this is that we identify as our yeah, egos. I'm not sure if that's the right word, but we have an individual identification. And I
Hmm.
think the Vedic resolution to that is to say, well, that's kind of an illusion. And
Hmm.
waking up from that, even in this level already, can allow you to come closer to God. And what Wolfgang Smith, I think, speaks about very well is that there's a massive difference between the Vedic, so the Eastern, let's say, the Vedic encompasses Hinduism, um,
Hmm.
and the Christian view. And that the Christian view is that you enter into relationship with God. And a relationship is something else than a complete merging with God, in that you maintain some sort of individual identity.
Hmm.
We spoke about this in our first conversation.
Hmm.
I find it really hard to conceptualize personally that there would be some sort of relationship um,
Hmm.
into the afterlife. But Joe speaks about when saints die, for example, they become more of themselves, like they become
Hmm.
shining version of themselves. Like that, to
Hmm.
me, intuitively, I find it hard to um, understand. That doesn't mean I don't agree with it. It's just that I don't understand it. I mean, I still call myself a
Hmm.
Christian, so
Hmm.
it would probably be closer to what I expect. But then, based on experience, based on my intuition, I understand that the Vedic view much more easily. And I
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
then you start to wonder, well, Christianity is a historical religion. Did that change? Is that possible to change? So then it pulls up another 17 questions.
Do you
Yeah.
mean change its view of the afterlife?
Well, not just the view of the afterlife. Does the afterlife itself change with the coming of Christ?
Oh, okay.
Because that's basically the idea here. And Wolfgang Smith looks at religion like he doesn't see the Vedic or the Christian as one that's better. He says they're fundamentally different. Like
Hmm.
they're hard to compare. So is there a different sort of afterlife in the Christian conception?
Yeah, I think I've heard him talk about this as well. It's like you can actually achieve the Vedic end goal. You can actually achieve that. It's not sort of saying that it's illusory. I think
Yeah,
he's sort of just asking the question of, do you actually want to achieve that? Like,
yeah.
you could have that, or you could have blissful, loving relationship with God for eternity. Doesn't it seem like you would want the latter option?
Mm.
Um, to me, I think both options are inconceivable. So that's a bit of a problem.
Yeah,
Um, Losing all sense of individual self, and for that matter, temporality. Um, I can't conceive of that. I can't distinguish that in my mind from non-being. And actually, that's really interesting because Buddhism actually uses more non-being, much more non-being terminology, emptiness, shunyata, emptiness as being the ultimate state, nirvana, snuffing out like you snuff out a candle. And there's a bit of debate around whether the end goal for Buddhists is the same as the end goal for non-dual Hindus. So Hindus, believe that there's only one being. So the monists, or some are monist. There's huge variety within Hinduism, but the Hinduism we know is monist. So there's one being, and that's Brahman, God. And all of us are just God's self-illusion. He's kind of tricking himself into believing that he's all these individuals. Alan Watts talks about this in a lovely fashion, as he's known to do. And so that's the Hindu view. And then the Buddhist view is that there's no self at all, and not even an absolute self. So there's not even one. There's Buddhism is very hard to explain, but they're not saying that there's literally nothing or there's zero. It's just that there's no substance at all. And so the aim of Buddhism is, well, again, nirvana is, as far as I know, I don't know Sanskrit, but I've read that it basically means to extinguish. So nirvana, the end goal of Buddhism, is the extinguishing of desire, and therefore the extinguishing of the individual self. And effectively, when you really look at it, it's a kind of suicide. The idea with Buddhism is that if you just killed your body, you would just be reborn. Or the identity that you are, because there's no true self, but the identity that you are and all the dispositions and all the energy would just get reborn again in a different body. So you can't win. The only thing you can do is kill your soul and achieve freedom. Now, why is this interesting? Because it's possible, and a lot of sort of modern gurus talk like this, it's possible that the Buddhist end goal is actually the same as the Hindu end goal. And you can talk about it in terms of one being and waking up as the one being, or you can talk of it in terms of extinguishing the individual self, extinguishing the illusion of the individual self, and that it all comes to the same thing. There's some interesting people out there as well who, one in particular, his name is Yuji Krishnamurti. He's passed away now, but not to be confused with Jiddu Krishnamurti, who was the more famous of the two Krishnamurtis. But this guy basically was an enlightened atheist, I guess you could say, or a radical materialist who also happened to have an enlightenment experience. And you can find videos of him on YouTube. He's fascinating to listen to. Instead of calling it enlightenment or something nice like that, he calls it the catastrophe or the calamity. I think it's the calamity. So when he experienced his calamity, he basically lost himself, like he lost his sense of self completely. Yeah. And he had followers and stuff. He claimed he never wanted followers. He never asked for followers. He kept telling people that he's got nothing to teach them, but people still gravitated towards him. And he was a physicalist, and but he had this strange experience of enlightenment. But anyway, I've rambled for a while about, I forget where I jumped off on that sort of train of thought. But any thoughts or reflections from that?
What makes it a calamity that he's experiencing? Why did he describe it as such?
Well, I think maybe he was just being a bit cheeky in one sense, but I think in another sense, it's a calamity because it's actually the death of the individual self. And so what he would tell people is, you don't actually want this. You don't actually want this because it means the death of your individual identity. You think you want you want to have my experience or my transformation, but you don't. And I think, his followers took this as a certain, like a kind of koan, like a little mysterious riddle that they had to solve but there's also the possibility that he was just being kind of honest.
Yeah.
And that you actually don't want this. I mean, I used to be very fascinated about enlightenment, sort of Eastern enlightenment, Buddhist or Hindu. And then I kind of realized that I don't actually want this. Like
No.
it's not, it's not just like my ego doesn't want it and I need to overcome my ego to get it. I just don't want it, you know? Like,
Yeah. Yeah,
yeah.
no, I understand. I think that's also part of I think it's part of the reason that, well, I think that might be how it works when you die, that if you are unable to let go of what you have, then perhaps there's more to be done in the temporal or the spatial domain. Like I think that part makes sense to me. It's like, so you will be reborn of some sorts, or maybe you stay in some sort of between space, but if you're not ready to let go, then maybe it's not time. But
Well,
then
think
it's a
about it.
funny thing with the
Sorry.
Christian. Go ahead.
Sorry, no, you go ahead. I've talked too much. Go ahead.
It's a funny thing with the Christian that is actually not a bad thing, that you don't let go fully of yourself. That I don't understand.
Well,
But then okay, so
mm,
my grandparents are all Christians. Um, I've lost all the last three of them that I grew up with in the last 2 years, and I had the luck to be able to speak to them in length about their theological ideas.
oh,
And so
yeah.
my mother's father, I asked him what he thinks of heaven or of the afterlife, and he's very much close to the book with all of these things and with his
Hmm.
faith. His faith in some ways is inspired by a fear of God, but
Hmm.
I asked him if he thought that he was gonna see his wife who had passed away like 25 years ago or 20
Hmm.
years ago. And he was like, "Well, no, I'll be with God, but it's unimaginable what that's like." Like he's like,
Hmm.
"That's not like it's not like I'm gonna walk up and give my wife a kiss or something." It's like he didn't think about
Hmm.
it like that. So even him in his like a completely Christian worldview, he also had this idea of like, well, it's nothing like you could possibly imagine it. And he also
Hmm.
didn't think about it like there's this individuality to it as much. Um,
Hmm.
at least not to the same degree as it is here. Maybe it works differently. I'm not sure.
Yeah. Well, I guess what is individuality? And is there a kind of individuality that is selfish and prone to evil? And is there also another individuality that is you know, luminous or free from evil? I think that that would be one, and that's maybe what Jonathan Peugeot is alluding to when he talks about the sort of transformation of saints, that there is an individuality that is free from selfishness.
Yeah,
So that would be one way, I think, to approach it. Um, I mean, you can't have love without real individuals. You could, well, let's put it this way. You can't have real love without real individuals. You can't have love at all without at least apparent individuality. Um, Even among Hindu mystics, there's really interesting sort of dynamic or phenomenon. So there, I've talked about, like I referred to, there's a lot of diversity within Hinduism. So there's the stuff that we know in the West, more or less, which is everything is one. And then there's like actual, like straight up devotional monotheisms as well. There's a really rich tradition in Hinduism of bhakti or devotion, loving devotion to God, usually to like a personal deity with like a certain image and a certain cult. So Krishna is a great example of this, Vishnu, Shiva. Um, and so there's Hindus that actually are explicitly dualist, like they're not non-dualist. They actually think that God and humans and each individual soul are eternally separate from each other. Um, but you get there's a fascinating 19th century mystic named Sri Ramakrishna, um, and he kind of had experience in all these different types of Hinduism. So devotional bhakti, a bit of tantra, a bit of Advaita, which is the non-dual kind of Hinduism. And so he could very, very easily go into a state of samadhi or absorption with God, with Brahman, the one. He was fundamentally an Advaitist, so he believed that, you know, there was only one being. But what's really interesting is his preference was for bhakti. And he would pray to his primary deity was Kali, which is a sort of female goddess. But he would pray to the Divine Mother, to Kali, to sort of keep him in his individuality, because he didn't want to merge with the One, because when you merge with the One, your experience effectively ceases. He entered, there's photos of him in trance. He would essentially enter a trance state and be uncommunicative. So he wanted to be an individual so that he could love God. He had a saying that you want to taste sugar, you don't want to become sugar.
Mm.
You know,
Mm.
he had all these wonderful little parables.
Yeah.
And so I think that's a key issue, is where does love fit in your ontology? For Christians, I think it has to fit at the very foundation. God is love.
Yeah.
And so that implies individuality, I would say.
Yeah, it has to, because it's the recognition of someone else or something else to be real. And if it's real, it's not just a apparent reality or apparent individuality. Like it has
Yes,
to. Do you know about internal family systems?
I do actually. Yeah.
I just learned about it last week a little bit, and then yesterday I did a short little meditation about of it.
Hmm.
And so you'll probably be able to explain it better than I do. Are you able to?
Well, I would say in a nutshell, it's that you can effectively communicate with different aspects of yourself, um, using sort of imaginal techniques, like sort of not meditation per se, but kind of creative imagination, things like that. You can actually talk to different aspects of yourself, and they eventually come to sort of a more healing relationship with them. So, for instance, you have a part of you that lashes out at others, or you have a part of you that's incredibly critical of others, and then you just do this compulsively and you don't know why. Well, if you actually talk to it, you find out that it's protecting this other part of you, this vulnerable child part. And then, eventually you talk to that vulnerable child part and you realize it's been wounded from, whatever event in childhood. And
Mm,
and so the healing continues. Yeah.
yeah.
Is that capture what you've understood as well?
Yeah, yeah, it fits right in. Another thing that I learned is that all the different parts, they're not bad, they're good. That's how they explain it. And that they only become bad when they're put in the wrong place. So what you
Mm,
described, when there's unresolved issues, or like in times of trauma, one part becomes dominant, and maybe that doesn't change after the trauma. So then there's things
yes.
that are not dealt with, or when your anger becomes the boss, let's say, inside of your
Yes.
system. Um, but all the
They're
parts
all
serve a function. Go ahead.
Yes, I was going to say pretty much the same thing. They're all trying to help you in
Yeah,
their own way.
yeah,
The
exactly.
problem is that they all have their own perspective. And so if that's too disconnected, then they're effectively harming you, because the way they think is helping you is actually harming you.
Yeah. Yeah, and then the question, the reason I bring it up is because there is a you in this scenario. So you consist of parts, but then they speak about the self, capital S.
Hmm. Hmm.
Now I wonder, okay, where do you get the self from, and what is the self? Because we're discussing individuality, of course. Well,
Hmm.
individuals are completely complex. Like if you talk to me, I feel like I have different parts. And the funny thing that they say as well is that people with multiple or split personality disorder also have these parts, but they're just to a
Hmm.
more intense degree. So,
Hmm.
but yeah, what is the self? What is that which remains? Because if the self is not your anger, if the self is not your, I don't know, lust, if your self is not this or that, then what is the self in that conception? So I
Oh,
don't know.
well, yeah, it's a great question.
Do you know, like it in terms of? Not, I'm not asking you if you know what the self is exactly, but in the conception of internal family systems, do they like expand on that notion, or?
From what I've read, which is relatively little, um, not too much, because in a way, I guess it's central, but in a way, like it's not essential that you have a developed kind of theory of it. My sense is that it's the observer. Like it's that, because you're asking sort of like, what is the self? If you're not your anger, if you're not your passion, if you're not your this or your that, then what is the self? Well, the only thing that remains is the thing that observes all these other things happening, right?
Yeah.
Um, and so the self becomes a pure observer. Now, I'm not saying this is the IFS doctrine on this, but that's sort of what strikes me as being the case,
Yeah.
which is again, a very Eastern Hindu slash Buddhist view, is
Mm.
that what remains is the observer. But the problem with that, why it doesn't maybe fit so well into a sort of Western Christian framework, is because if everyone's self is just the observer, then they're all essentially identical. They don't have any
Yes.
distinguishing characteristics, you know.
Yeah.
Um, so it's not like you have a special, unique character. You, like me, are just pure consciousness. So we might as well be the same consciousness. You know
Yeah.
what I mean? Which I think could well be true. Like I'm not saying it's wrong, but I think it goes against the Western
Yeah.
approach to things.
No, absolutely. I'm looking at the what they describe as qualities of the self. So I don't think,
Hmm.
yeah, I don't really think that they just think about it as an observer. I know you didn't say that because that's what you think yourself. But they say that there's qualities of self. And I heard this yesterday as well. You have the 8 C's and the 5 P's. Actually, I'll
Okay.
pull it up
Yep.
on the screen so you see it. It's like it's relayed in a flower of life type of thing. Let me see if I can share. Yeah, share screen. This one. Am I sharing it?
Um, I'm yes, I can see it now.
So you have compassion for people listening. There's basically
Hmm.
like a flower displayed, and you have the 8 C's, which are compassion, creativity, curiosity, connectedness, I think, connected, courage, confidence, clarity, calm, and then the 5 P's: presence, perspective, patience, playfulness, and persistence.
Yes, yes, I remember this now. It's been a long time since I looked at this, so my apologies. Yeah.
Yeah, so I wonder why they associate this with the self, because even when I think about something like courage, like what courage is acting not in the absence of fear, but in spite of your fear to do something. Um, and I think that there's a lot of other qualities here that I see, like patience or playfulness, that also require your parts, if you know what I mean.
I mean, that's I would agree with that. I'm going to be a bit more cautious because I obviously haven't looked at this well enough to sort of to comment on why they actually um, took these specific qualities. But as a general response, I would say that all of this is very specific, and it does seem like it would require specific parts of you. Um, it's it seems hard to ground it in just like the thing that remains is innately creative, curious, and courageous and calm. I mean, why?
Yeah.
Um, I guess maybe you could reason that, for instance, if we're thinking about the reason I emphasize the observer though is important because the observer is, um, this is the approach that you're taking to these parts, at least part of the approach, right? You're not just purely like a cold observer just watching them, but part of the approach is that you're um, disidentifying with them in order to just see how they play out, how they are in you. Because usually we're identified them. If we're angry, if our angry part is active, then we just are angry. So you could argue that to the extent that you're able to observe your angry part, you are in fact calm, right? Because the part of you that's observing has to be
Yes.
calm.
Yes.
So
Okay.
there's a certain logic there.
Yeah.
You could
Yeah.
also argue the same with compassion, I would say too, because to really to really see something unfold, or to have a relationship with another person, which in this case is a part, you have to have a certain degree of compassion. I think empathy would be a better term, but it doesn't start with C, so it didn't make it.
Yeah. Oh, that
So
makes
there's a
sense.
logic there, maybe.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes actually a lot of sense. I also, so I told you yesterday I did this exercise where you would go and there would be a room, and inside of the room would be someone that triggers you.
Hmm.
And the part that protects you or that like gets active when you're triggered, you're gonna leave that part outside of the room, and then you're gonna enter the room without that part. And you're gonna
Hmm.
ask that part, okay, is it okay if I go in? And then you can see how the interaction goes without the part of you that's getting triggered.
Hmm.
Uh, and you do notice that you turn into a, well, quite obviously, really, you turn into a more calm, compassionate type
Hmm.
of person.
Hmm.
Actually, I really struggled with finding someone that really triggers me. I kept switching between people. Like I would be like,
Yeah.
okay, maybe like an atheist or someone. So I was like, let's do Sam Harris. But like, I understand Sam Harris. I have compassion
Yeah.
for him. I don't hate him. And then I was like, let me figure out some political leaders, but I just couldn't figure it out. So I kept switching them. So I guess I need to find someone that really triggers me. But I'll get back to you on that.
You're
Uh,
already too calm and compassionate. You can't do this work.
well, I don't know if that's what it is. I think it's just that I understand. Like I get triggered all the time. So it's not like I'm always
Mm.
some serene being. It's just that I can always see the other person's perspective still, even though I can strongly disagree with people. I'm like, oh, well, I could get to this point of view too, you know?
Mm. Hmm.
So yeah,
Yeah.
it's a bit of a fun tangent this, but it's for Vervaeke to talk about IFS. And he also related it to Christianity, where he was afraid that, or afraid is maybe not the right word, but he was cautious about how some Christians may interpret this. Like he thought, he asked the guy who was an expert on this, I think, who does this type of therapy, if he often gets bad comments from Christians because um, he might be dealing with demons or some sort.
Hmm.
Because he said that a lot of Christians they basically only want to hear the voice of Jesus and maybe their conscience.
Yeah.
And so I thought about that. One thing that I thought about it was like, okay, this I think shows a bit of John's bad experience again with Christianity, because the guy was also like, yeah, I don't really get that, you know, like I'm
Yeah.
not really bothered by that so much, but I think it still sits quite deep, and I think also John deals with a lot of people that, or has dealt with people that, I mean, being Christian is a tough term in terms of you're trying to follow Christ. But if that's filled with judgment and what he grew up in, it doesn't
Yeah. I
fit.
mean,
Yeah, go ahead.
totally, totally. I, I could understand why a Christian would find it. I think it would be unjustified to be sort of like mad at IFS if you're a Christian, but I can see that there's certain potential conflicts there. I mean,
Yeah.
how do you know the difference between a demon and a part? Is there any difference? Isn't this just implying that there's none and that every demon is actually just a innocent part of you that just wants to be loved and accepted? Like, there is real, I think there is real conflict with the worldview of Christianity and the worldview of IFS. Um, which is a worldview, like all these sort of therapeutic approaches are
Yeah.
effectively little mini religions. They're little worldviews that shape the way that people. I mean, it's got all this, it's this implicit doctrine here that we've just looked at that your true self is intrinsically good. So that's again like I
Yeah.
mean, I don't want to argue against it because it's quite a nice doctrine, but still, it's a very, it does beg a lot of questions that your intrinsic self is just happens to be courageous, compassionate, calm, etc., etc. And
Yeah.
it's nothing bad. It's got no capacity for evil.
Yeah. Yeah, that's pretty interesting view. Yeah, I think, well, if you think about it in a Christian sense, of course, we think that um, Christians think that I mean, you're battling evil all the time. So you're battling your own sin, and sin is an inherent part of being a human. But is the self human exactly, or is it more of like a soul? Because I don't think the Christians would say that, would they? Would a soul be sinful?
Well,
Because you
I
could have
think
a
I think
corrupted
so.
soul, no?
Yeah.
right?
I think it could become sinful.
Yeah.
Um, I think it depends on whose theology you're talking about, right? If you're talking about like hardcore Calvinism, I don't know, maybe they'd have some subtle way to dispute this, but it seems to me that if you're talking about like a theology that believes that some souls are predestined to hell and some are predestined to heaven, then it must be the case that some souls are just intrinsically sinful.
Yeah, okay.
Um, but if you're talking about other sort of more flexible kinds of theology, no, I don't, I think that, a soul can become sinful, but that's not its intrinsic nature.
It's this funny
Um,
thing of being able to sell your soul to the devil. It's like,
mm,
I think that implies more like that the soul is a good thing and then you can lose it. But I think the
mm.
soul in most people's conception is more of something that can get corrupted and it's just an inherent part of you.
Yeah, I think that the interpretations of Christianity that resonate with me hold the soul to be basically good because it's a creation of God, in the image of God, out of love. So it must be good, right? Like
Mm.
the reason that the fall is called a fall is because it's originally good. Like,
Yeah. Yes.
and we're trying to restore that. So that would be my sort of take on that, I guess. But I don't know if I believe in it, so what does that matter? But yeah.
Well, it means you think about things, and that's good. I like it.
I think, yeah. I mean, so we were sort of talking about individuality, and I guess that's why we're talking about IFS and soul and so forth. Um, so where do I want to go with this?
Can I play something?
Absolutely.
So
Yeah.
because we spoke about Vervaeke before, I wanted to do it some justice and pull up the
Mhm.
because I asked him about miracles. And
Oh,
so I'll pull
yes.
up that I asked this question. That's good.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I haven't seen this, so this will be really interesting.
All right. Because I don't even remember what he said, to be honest. Okay, I'm sharing. Yeah, you got it.
Um, it's loading. It's loading. Yep, I see it now.
Okay, you tell me if it runs okay. From Latin, of course,
Yeah.
but to me it reads very nicely. I wanted to quickly ask you a specific question about a chapter called Miracles. Um, in nature, nothing happens that does not follow from its laws. That's what he said in this chapter. Do you
Yeah.
view nature and reality similarly, and do you therefore disagree with Jung's idea of synchronicities?
Um, that's a harder question to answer because there's a lot of stuff that's presupposed. I agree with Spinoza that there 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 aren't two worlds governed by two different kinds of laws because that ultimately makes reality unintelligible and divided against itself, which undermines our primary way of understanding what reality is. Reality is primarily given by our sense of realness and how everything sort of hangs together. Although it also is given by the fact that we are shocked by the fact that all of our conceptions are always inadequate. So and Spinoza gets that that's what intelligibility is. It's sort of this, right? It's how everything hangs together, but how that ostends and points towards something that can't be grasped. So you get this in the, he tells you this right from the beginning of the ethics, you know, the nature of God is such that, infinite and infinite attributes, and we can only grasp two of them. Two out of infinity is a very small number. And so I agree with that. And I do not, and so I don't, if miracles mean something that's ultimately absurd or that involves something like one world with one set of laws intruding sort of invasive metaphysics into our world, I reject it because I think that is fundamentally a tear in being, which is, of course, the classical description of evil. That would be profound evil, and profoundly unintelligible, and unthinkable. Um, and so I agree with him in that sense. Now, I don't think that I agree with Spinoza's reduction, this is where I think he was too much under the influence of Descartes, of all of causation into sort of billiard ball causation. I reject that. Well, think about Wolfgang and vertical causation, and then Whitehead, it's vertical and horizontal, and that's dynamical in self-organizing, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So as long as you don't pin me to that billiard ball model of causation, I agree with what I think to be the core of Spinoza's proposal, which is miracles fundamentally would represent a tear in being and reality.
Yeah.
And I think that that's ultimately something that makes, how would you, I mean, this is David Hume, how would you possibly get evidence for that?
Yeah.
I mean, that, or you can't give evidence for it or reason to believe in it.
Okay. Thank you. That's really
good.
good.
People will cite Revelation or the Bible or the Quran or something. My problem there is if that's miraculous in the sense of a world operating to other laws invading ours, then that of course is a tear in being, an assault, an invasion, etc.
Yeah, and what does that make God also? I think it's a good question to ask. All right, you got it?
Yeah, that was brilliant.
Good. Okay, so why don't you respond to this? What's your first thoughts about it? What he said?
Well, well, my very first response is that Vervaeke is a beautiful soul. Like, you always get the sense when I'm watching him talk, like just how genuinely thoughtful and compassionate he is. Just talking about like, what is the nature of self? I guess he could probably convince me that the IFS model is real. I know he has some problems with it anyway, but anyway, aside from that, in terms of the actual content, I love how starkly he puts it, like that if this was other laws invading our world or our laws or our reality, it would basically be evil. So it'd be absurd and evil and horrible. I think that's a bit overstated, but from my perspective, but I love that he put it in such a clear, potent and stark way. Like this is actually what he's against. What he's for is the unity of being, the unity of all our reality. It all fits together basically. And so in that sense, I get why he's a naturalist or a non-reductive physicalist. I guess what would I say to that? I mean, he could just be right. He's probably right. I mean, he's probably right. I guess what I would say is, where does that leave free will? Is there a sense in which human beings, just on a daily basis, cut into the laws of nature by just doing things just because they want to? Or, you know, I haven't heard him talk too much about free will. So I'm not sure exactly where he stands on that. I would assume he's a kind of compatibilist. Do you know?
No, I don't know his exact view on free will. I know he's definitely not a determinist. But I'll say this about it. Like you started off when you spoke about Vervaeke before, is that I think you said he believes in a leveled view of reality.
Yes,
like
leveled ontology. Yeah.
Yeah, leveled ontology. And what he briefly discussed just now when he pulled up Wolfgang, because we spoke about Wolfgang before in the video, is this idea of vertical causation and this idea that I don't know. Are you familiar with vertical causation? It's a bit.
I'm familiar with it in as much as Vervaeke's talked about it, which is unless I'm thinking of a different concept, it's the idea that the higher levels constrain the lower levels. Is that right, or is that a different thing that he talks about?
Yeah, I think that's true on some level for sure. It's I'll give you an example of vertical causation. Is that so a horizontal causation would be one that operates in space and time. So if I throw a rock to a window and the window breaks, then the cause of the window breaking is me throwing the rock. That's horizontal causation. Vertical causation operates almost completely outside of time. So vertical causation happens, for example, when in quantum physics, you know, this observer phenomenon where when I observe quantum potential, I don't think particle is the right word, but when I observe that, I bring it into reality. So
Mm-hmm.
there's quantum potentiae. I think that's the best
Mm-hmm.
word to use. And then once a human observes it, it gets pulled into reality, and you can sort of like they sort of become particles in a sense.
Mm-hmm.
That's the difficult explanation. An easier explanation would be how an archetype of it. This is the easier explanation. So
Okay.
there, a tree has a sort of like an archetype to it.
Mm-hmm.
So you're gonna understand maybe the archetype is like a blueprint. So what
Mm-hmm.
makes a tree a tree? There's certain aspects of a tree that cause us to see it always as a tree. So or a finger, for example,
Mm-hmm.
or a hand is better actually. Like my
Mm-hmm.
hand, from when I was born, I had 5 fingers. The reason that it grew into 5 fingers is because, well, that's where you can pull in the vertical causation. It's not so much that um, that I was conceived that I necessarily have the 5 fingers. The vertical causation explanation is that there's some sort of human archetype, a human blueprint of the human body, the biological body, and that
Mm-hmm.
causes me to look like that. And same with the tree. There's sort of like an archetype of tree that causes us to recognize tree among all these
Mm-hmm.
different variations of tree. Um,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know
Yeah,
if that helps in any way.
it's like the Aristotelian formal cause, right? Of the four
Yeah,
causes, it's the formal cause.
yeah,
Um, yeah, I think it might be in synergy with what I was referring to, where the higher levels constrain the lower, because I think there's some way that he has to interpret that back into a scientific naturalist framework, because we could mean different things about, and when we say there's an archetype of a tree, we could mean different things, right?
yeah,
Um, so I think there's a way that he is able to interpret that back into a physicalist, but a non-reductive physicalist, but a physicalist ontology, because we could mean that there just exists metaphysically an archetype of a tree, in the Aristotelian sense, or even something stranger than that, maybe the Platonic sense. I don't think he means that. I think that what he must mean is that, encoded in the DNA, there is the pattern, the form of the tree that it will take, right?
yeah,
Something like that.
yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Hmm.
DNA is a good,
Hmm.
it's a good, and I want to tie it into free will in the sense that um, we are also level beings. So in many ways, everything stems from the highest level. Now I'm talking in like the Platonic worldview,
Hmm.
and so with free will, for example, the reason that physicists argue against free will is because they're measuring the biological dashboard, um, to use Kastrup's language. They're measuring what's happening on the neurological level, perhaps. Um,
Hmm.
but Wolfgang's point, and I think Vervaeke would agree with this, is that human beings are not just the biological, so they're not just operating on that level of reality. They also have their thinking faculty, so they can they can think just in time and not in space. And
Hmm.
and then there's something else, and perhaps free will ties into that there's some sort of a vertical thing going on that's beyond space and time, where there's maybe not an intervention into reality, but there's definitely, like you say, that the higher levels constrain the lower ones. So that's
Yeah, I guess. Yeah, there's a so in the Vervaeke way of thinking about it, it's emanation and emergence, right? So the higher levels emerge out of the lower
yes,
levels, but they
yes,
also, in a sense, emanate the lower levels, or they constrain. The way I've heard him talk about it is that they constrain the lower levels. There's only, because the higher levels exist, there's only certain things that the lower levels can do, because they have to work within that framework. Um, and so, and that's cool. Like I like that. That kind of, you get to keep the levels and you keep the naturalism at the same time. And humans exist within that. They're just a level or a part of this great system.
yeah,
Um, but I think if you were like a hard believer in free will, um, you would have to say, I think you would have to say that the human being is outside of nature, that the human being is actually out in the essence, is outside of the whole system and God as well is also outside of the whole thing, and that they can, I mean, and to the extent we have bodies and brains and so forth, we're in it, but there's a part of us, a core of us that is absurd, to put it one way, or at least transcendent, to put it another way.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that was what I was sort of getting at.
No, I
And
understand.
yeah,
I,
I'm trying to
I
think of
wonder, like,
other. Yeah,
go
go
ahead.
ahead. No, you go ahead.
Well, so this idea of there it being outside of some sort, like, you know, for Vervaeke in the clip just now, it's like he really is against the two world type of thing.
Yes,
Um,
yes.
so outside, I think, yeah, I think that it's best resolved in a leveled type of ontology. So reality is reality. That's to me, reality is one thing, let's say.
Reality is one. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
reality is one. But there are levels to it. And I think the
Mm,
one thing unique about human, well, maybe not unique about human beings, can be careful with my language, but what we as human beings have the ability to do is to operate on different levels. Um,
yeah.
so even in the Platonist conception, dreaming is already being on another level. Uh,
Hmm.
Dreaming is on a level that doesn't have space, or the space is false in a sense,
Yes.
but the time
Yeah.
is real. Uh, and so you can pull that up even higher, I think. But yeah, that's
Even even the time though often doesn't quite fit into
no,
real time. It's got
it's
it's like
true.
its own time in a way.
Yeah, that's what it feels like, at least, huh?
Mm,
Like when you're in
mm.
the dream, sometimes my dreams feel like hours and hours and hours and days. Sometimes you come out of it, it's like, okay, there's something funky going on, and then you forget it in 2 seconds. But
All this weirdness makes me lean towards, at least if I wouldn't go as far as to say that there's some such thing as like outside reality or multiple realities, I would say that reality actually includes a lot more, um, what would you say, chaos within it.
yeah,
Um, Chaos, sort of empty space, free space to move within, something like that, just trying to fetch for metaphors. I
yeah,
mean, you talked about the observer kind of, in quantum physics, the observer collapses the wave function. Well, I mean, that's kind of, I mean, I would think of that as being somewhat miraculous. I think that by traditional standards, that's kind of miraculous.
yeah.
Um, there's and just with quantum phenomena in general, there is an inherent indeterminacy there on the, well, potentially, some people say that ultimately we just haven't discovered the determinacy. But as far as we know, the basic level of reality includes intrinsically indeterminacy and unpredictability. Um, so it seems like that must also be part of existence. So I think that, yeah, if we were to characterize Vervaeke's view, it would be reality is one, which I think is a very common conception. Maybe it's global. I'm trying to think of cultures that would have had it. Well, I guess he argues that the two worlds model of, like, Abrahamic religions is the counterexample, but
Well, is that a two worlds model?
exactly. I mean, to what extent is heaven a different reality? I think that actually the traditional insistence, at least within Christianity and Islam and Judaism, to be fair, the traditional insistence is that it's actually this world that gets transformed at the end of time.
Yeah,
So it's not actually talking about another world.
yeah.
Um, so yeah, so reality is one, and then I wonder how much give he allows, like, reality is. In what sense is he a determinist, and in what sense is he not a determinist?
I'll say a bit
Um,
about his free will because
hmm,
you asked me if I know his
yes.
what he thinks about it. I just remembered something about it.
Okay.
So when he speaks about free will, he often says, well, do you want to have free will? Like, do you want to have to decide over every movement of your body? So that's this idea of being completely conscious.
Yes.
So
Yes.
if I'm conscious of every step I take, I wouldn't have a good time walking.
Yes.
He's like, you don't want that. This is what you
No.
want. You want to be guided by love and truth. You want
Yes.
to bound yourself by these higher virtues. Not sure. Um, but I think in that he already implies that there is some sort of freedom to do so. Um, this is
Yeah.
what go ahead.
Freedom is included in those concepts in a way, right? Like
Yeah.
love has to be free, but it's also a
Yes.
constraint. Yeah.
Yes. And love is relational, and love to be real, it has to be voluntary. So there's all
Hmm.
these aspects in which you can implicitly see that he believes in some sort of freedom there. Um, but I think he makes a good point of like we absolutize freedom so much. Like we want our free will to be real so bad that we don't realize that
Yes.
freedom to do anything is not always a good thing, especially when there's parts of you that will manipulate that. Like I'm not very good with free time. I'm happy we're doing the podcast. I'm happy that I'm working on things. Like I cannot be at home studying so well when I'm on my own because I would just get distracted. So I force myself to go to a different place, the library or whatever. And then because there's people around me, because I'm in a different setting, I'm constraining myself, but it's better for me. So I'm giving myself less freedom by not being at home and having all the food I want,
Yeah.
TV and everything, but it's actually better for me. So it's a choice in some sense.
Yeah, constraint is indispensable. And so
Yeah.
on that level, I absolutely agree with that sentiment of freedom is overrated. And it becomes just the ability to arbitrarily choose anything effectively, which is kind of meaningless, right? Like the key issue should be like, are you going where you want to go? And are you being the type of being that you want to be? And um, both of those have a certain the freedom is kind of necessary in those because you don't want to be an automaton, but a huge amount of constraint, discipline, regulation, etc., is also part of that. So on that level, I agree totally. I guess I was thinking more on the like absolute metaphysical level, like at the end of the day,
Yeah.
do we have, and also what does that mean? Does it just mean consciously choosing as well?
Yeah, that's a
Um,
funny thing.
yeah,
Like that we
yeah.
imply that already in the free will. Like when Vervaeke speaks about taking the step consciously. I mean, that's just the left hemisphere view of free will.
Are you familiar with the Libet experiments about free will? The sort of twitch
No.
your finger when you, okay.
Oh wait, is this
Um,
the wait, can you elaborate? Is this the where you do something and then it's mapped in your brain?
Yeah, so I can't remember the full name of the guy. I think it was Benjamin Libet, but it was done in the 80s, I think, 80s and 90s. And basically what they got people to do was just arbitrarily choose to move their finger. And in the meantime, they were like looking at like a very fast dial that was showing basically fractions of a second.
Yeah.
And they said, like, note where the dial is when you make the decision to move your finger. Meanwhile, they were measuring their brain waves. And then they were basically saying, oh, look, whatever it was quite big. I think it was maybe like 200, 400 milliseconds before they actually
Yeah.
consciously decided to move their finger. The brain waves were building to that action before they even apparently were consciously aware of it. What was interesting though is they could stop that process arbitrarily as well, consciously. So Libet, I think he wrote about we don't have free will, but we have free won't. We can stop an action, but we can't initiate one consciously. But one question that comes up when people sort of think about this and what it means for free will is, well, is free will equated with, is it just the same thing as conscious choice? Well, there's two big issues. One is free will as trivial as moving your finger, or is that just like an arbitrary random movement that doesn't mean much? I think that actually McGilchrist talks about these experiments at some stage in his book that you're reading.
Yeah.
But so another issue is like, well, what is the self that free will pertains to? Is it just the conscious self, or is it something deeper? What
Mhm.
if you do have free will, you freely chose to move your finger, 400 milliseconds before you consciously registered the decision, but it was still you, like it was your deep self that decided to move the finger, something like that, like
Yeah.
what is the self actually? Like
Yeah.
what is the thing that has free will?
Yeah. And then, I mean, those experiments, people that base their view of free will on those experiments, I feel bad for. I have a
Yeah.
friend whose father is a neurologist.
Uh-huh.
Is that a, yeah, neurologist? And he
Hmm.
bases his view on free will on that, and that makes him a hard determinist. And like, well, there's so many like there's so many reasons why that doesn't conclude the free will debate like at all, like not even a little bit. And I
Mm.
think I like the way Castro speaks about the brain, and when there's psychedelic experiences and you see the brain doing all these things, and people reduce it all the way to that. Um, it's like, why reduce it to the neurological level? Like, why is that the
Mm.
most real thing? Um,
Hmm.
and just because it's decided in the brain before it happens in the body, why does it make it not free of some sort? And so I'm not even saying that it isn't. It's just I don't think it's very good argumentation, like philosophically speaking. And
Well, I
that's
think, yeah, if you're basing your whole view of free will on those experiments, I don't think that's very wise. Um, but I do think it is a data point, like it is something. It does
it's
tell us
very
something.
interesting.
Yeah, it would have been like quite striking if we found that it like the brain activity totally coincided with
Yeah,
the conscious choice. I mean, that would have given us some evidence that maybe free will does exist in the sense that we commonly think about it as conscious decision.
yeah.
But yeah, I don't think you can throw out free will with
But you see how it goes both ways, like you say.
mm,
Like, but both take a wrong presupposition. Is that you could base it off of that biological happenstance. Um, so I would have felt similarly about if people if it did coincide and people based free will
yeah.
off of that.
And they were just like free will's being proved. Yeah.
Yeah, they would feel similarly
Yeah.
stupid, let's say.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. I mean, free will is very mysterious, whatever we mean by free will.
Yes. And then
And
consciousness. Who
consciousness.
understands consciousness? That's it.
I mean, it seems that these phenomena are always like consciousness is always mixed in with unconsciousness. Free will is always mixed in with constraint. It's hard to sort of point to a moment and be like, that was me exercising my free will. That was me being perfectly conscious. It's like that was me being a little bit conscious, but mostly sort of deluded. And that was me exercising a little bit of free will that was kind of conditioned and clouded by all this constraint.
Yeah.
Um, I think that these things are sort of just mixed in together in reality. Maybe taking one extreme or the other is equally wrong.
Yeah.
Um, I feel
Yeah.
like
And
McGilchrist would think that. Yeah, go ahead.
I have an intuition that it might also be a similar thing to us mistaking um, reality to be completely subjective and objective. Um,
Yes.
so yeah, I think it's a similar like mistake we make, that we have some sort of framework and then we base it off of that. But it's interesting, like the justice system, um, like there's been cases where I heard about this on a podcast, that there was a court case with someone and they argued against his guilt because of, he didn't really have free will, like he was kind of determined to do whatever
Yes.
crime he committed because evolutionarily speaking and this and that. It's like,
Yeah.
yeah, if we really start to believe this as a whole, like if we really start to divert from the idea of free will, or God for that matter, it would have some severe consequences for what criminality means and what you can do. And well, then I also hear Sam Harris counter that with some things, but when
I
Wolfgang
mean,
Smith,
yeah,
go
it's
on.
interesting because sorry, I
No,
cut
no,
you off. What were you?
go.
I was just saying it's interesting because in a sense they do have a point. I think the justice system rightly has a libertarian in the sense of metaphysically libertarian, like it believes in free will position, and it
Yeah.
has to. It has to because otherwise, like it wouldn't achieve its function as a justice system. Like
Hmm.
no one would be responsible for anything.
Yeah.
Um, but the reality is that actually, like we're massively constrained by biology and circumstances, and like maybe completely. So you kind of have to just run with this fiction to a certain degree in order to have this thing, which ultimately is useful. Like you could argue from a utilitarian perspective, at least, well, I don't know if this is true, but we'll assume that it decreases crime in the long run if you punish people for their actions, right?
Yeah.
So it's got a use. What was that? I was going to say something. Yes. Okay. So the view that you could even be completely determined, to me, that's incoherent. And for this reason, the idea, like the whole concept of the self dissolves if you try and imagine a self that is only determined, like it has no free will at all. So it's not like X did the murder, but he was totally determined. So he was just, you shouldn't punish him. That to me is just saying X doesn't exist.
Yeah.
Like if there's no way that you could be free, there's no way that you're determined. Does that make sense? Like there's
Yeah.
no constraint, there's no compulsion.
Mm-hmm.
You can't have those opposites if one of the opposites isn't even possible.
Yeah, exactly. No, you're right. I I remember when Wolfgang was asked about free will,
Mm,
Kurt pulled up an example of a physicist saying something about free will, being like, "I'm sad to say, but it doesn't exist," and this and that. And Wolfgang goes like, "I think it's disgusting that a human being could say something like that." And I just love that so much because he's like so appalled by some of these things. Like we're used to it, we're used to
yeah.
people saying stuff like that because it's just the modern scientific paradigm seems to be a religious one for some, and so that's what he calls scientism,
Mhm.
not being scientific. But yeah, like some of it does sound really inhumane if you really pull it there, and it's exactly what McGilchrist describes when the emissary becomes the master. Uh,
Right. Yeah.
starts to think up some weird things. It can get really dark really quickly, and then another thing about it is that I can understand people from a almost completely determinist point of view saying that evil is not a real thing. Um,
Hmm.
because you could pretty much explain all crime and then they'll be like, yeah, well, we'll still lock them up, but they're not really guilty. And I think one of the dangers in that is that you just remove agency. It's similar
Yeah.
to playing a victim role where you blame all of your problems on external cause.
Yeah.
So I have a lot of empathy for people that are in different circumstances that are difficult, and you have, a lot of forces seemingly working against you. But if you start to give
Hmm.
into that, well, what are you going to do with your life? Like you're removing all responsibility, and I think you're removing meaning from your life.
Absolutely. And I think we actually owe it to criminals to try them and punish them in a sense, because
Yeah,
that is actually speaking to their human dignity. You're not just saying, you're just, you were just completely determined. You didn't choose this at all. You can't choose any different, but maybe we can condition you like to be different.
yeah.
Maybe we'll sort of, have you seen Clockwork Orange, that whole thing?
No, what is that?
Oh, it's a Kubrick movie. I think it's Kubrick. It's one of its premises is that it's sort of set in a kind of dystopian future. But one of its premises is that they try to like because they're like, enlightened in the sense of like progressive, they don't want to punish, they want to like recondition you. So they kind of condition this guy to feel bad, basically, by like like violent imagery with like nausea and disgust. And so it's a bit hard to explain, but like look it up. It's
Yeah.
a famous movie. It's got a like
Just to look
really
up the pictures, it look pretty creepy.
Yeah, it's got a really interesting aesthetic. But basically, yeah, the thing that you sort of take from it is like that's actually bad to do that. And people now, I think there'll be a new temptation towards that with the kind of technology that we have now to
Yeah,
sort of just say, if not to do something so crude, maybe to like try and change people's memories. I mean, who knows? Like, like
Yeah.
change people's personality, just make them nicer people. But all of that is just absolutely destructive to human dignity.
Yeah, absolutely. And it reminds me of what Jung convinced me of, that philosophy, and Vervaeke to a certain degree as well. Like
Mm,
philosophy is almost primary in what happens in reality. So the ideas, they almost um, precede the happening. So he approached the 20th century Vervaeke in his Awakening to the Meaning Crisis series. He approached that
mhm,
by looking at the ideas first. So you look at, okay, what is Marxism? What is Nazism? What are these ideas based off of? Where did they
mhm,
come from? What is the history of them? And
mhm,
then you start to realize that this stuff is like, it has big consequence for what happens in the world. And similar with
mhm,
these type of movies, it tries to play ahead of like, okay, if we really take these ideas to their logical conclusions, where does that leave us as a society? um,
mhm.
and that's the big argument for like, well, now Richard Dawkins calls himself a civilizational uh, Christian, I believe.
Oh,
um,
that's nice.
because
Cool.
he
Yeah.
starts to realize, oh my, 1 second,
Everyone's becoming a civilizational Christian now.
sorry, you talk for a sec, I have to turn my phone off.
Okay. Yeah, yeah. Man, what to talk about though? Civilizational Christianity. I don't know.
Yeah, I'll
Oh,
lead
you're
off with
back?
that. It's
Cool.
that they start to realize um, that the ideas are so important, even though they can't prove them, that they cannot get rid
Hmm.
of them. And so
Hmm.
um, so they start to try to embody them without the belief. And I think the funny part about that is that I think once you start acting as a Christian, you slowly start to become one too, because being a Christian is
Yeah.
not really belief. Um, that's at least the way I got back to it, is realizing that the behavior part is much more primal in that sense.
Hmm. Hmm.
So yeah,
Yeah. I mean, that makes a lot of sense. Maybe we'll see Richard Dawkins, a genuine Christian one day. Who knows? Richard Dawkins praying.
but I think he would have to do like a lot of mushrooms before he gets out of his opinions. But we shall see.
What amazes me is that and I don't follow Sam Harris too much, but what amazes me is that guy actually does do a lot of psychedelics, but he's still pretty, what would you say, like atheist, certainly. And
Yeah,
in terms of his ontology, would it be fair to just say he's a physicalist or?
yeah, I'm not sure. I don't listen to Sam a lot these days either.
Mm,
But yeah, he's. I remember him describing his psychedelic experiences, and it's quite beautiful. Like my brother sent me one of his. He made a video of it with an animation as well, and he would feel like this is really mind. This is mind at large. Like he's really feeling the
hmm.
intensity of it and the love of it, and he thought it was
Hmm.
beautiful. Um, and then he starts to get back into his left hemisphere, and it's like, well,
Yeah.
but there's no reason to based on this and that. And then one time I also saw him speak about God with Glenn Glenn Lowry. I don't know if you're
Hmm.
familiar with him. Anyway, I think he's more of a political commentator. But Glenn Lowry
Okay.
used to be in church, and he used to be a Christian, but he turned atheist later on in life, and before he was atheist as well. And he was kind of just talking with Sam about what could people possibly mean when they say that God is real. Um, and then you see Sam start to talk about this mysterious type of thing. I would actually love to find this clip, but I think it will be too difficult. I don't think it's clipped anywhere. But you start to see him speculate about what people could mean by God, if not just a being in sky. And it's like, oh, well, you're much closer than you think you are, I think. Um, but yeah, I mean,
Okay.
I like Kastrup's view on Sam Harris. Kastrup is like, he doesn't really take him seriously. And I think it's not that you shouldn't hear his ideas and realize that a lot of people are listening to them and they're uh, influenced by him, but it doesn't take him serious in the sense like he doesn't see him as a serious thinker on the topics that he often speaks about, because
Mm,
he's a neuroscientist, you know.
hmm.
And it's what Wolfgang says as well, is like physicists are often good scientists but terrible philosophers. Like
Mm,
it doesn't say much about your philosophical foundation that you're good at being a scientist with hard sciences. That's
mhm.
just, yeah. And even if
I
you go ahead.
yeah. I was just going to say, I do have an appreciation for him. I think I would have previously had more of an allergy for him and people of that kind of persuasion, but I don't know. I think that um, they have a role, and they're kind of precision and clarity in a certain sense, but it's left brain precision and left brain clarity. But still, I think that it actually can be really helpful in a conversation, because you can also get the opposite problem of just being extremely vague, or just sort of like thinking things up that are edifying and nice and inspiring, but there's
Yeah.
no hard
Yes.
there's no hard evidence or argument for them. And
That's what I
so
love about speaking to Vervaeke.
mm,
Like
mm,
he's so scientific. So part
yes,
of his job is to specify and to really be specific with language. And so even
yes,
though it's fun to speak with people that are extremely open and don't really have a scientific foundation because they're able to enter into different realms of reality, so to
yes,
speak. He keeps that precision, so his left hemisphere remains active, and I think Sam is an example of that as well. And I don't hate Sam again. I sometimes get triggered by what he says, but I really don't hate him, and I have sympathy for um, a lot of what he tries to do. Like right now, he's obsessed with his meditation app, and yeah, I do see a lot of love in that person. You know?
well, absolutely. Man, what was I going to say just before? Oh, yeah, Vervaeke definitely is in that sweet spot where he can use the left hemisphere really well, but
Yeah,
he does not lose touch with the right hemisphere. Like it's
yeah,
just wonderful, and sort of like mind and body, because he does Tai Chi and things like that. Just absolutely extremely well integrated person.
yeah.
Um, but yeah, um,
I'll say this
what?
about him
Yeah.
that he takes his consciousness very seriously.
Yes.
So he treats it like something sacred, and
Yes.
and that I think is very admirable. So he does all these practices, and then he also says, "Yeah, like, this is the reason my hair looks like this. You know, this is the reason I have a belly." like, although I'm not sure if that should completely justify those things, um, I do I do see where he's coming from. Like he's in many ways showing us a completely different way to live from the modernist way to live, and
Absolutely.
and he shines forth.
Oh,
So
he absolutely does. I think he's incredibly compelling. I think there's still some remainder in me that resists him for some reason, and I think that's to do with maybe it's a personality difference, but I think it's also just like a stubborn sense that there actually is something absurd and inexplicable in reality, to come back to our previous point.
yeah,
Um, like there is something chaotic in the nature of reality. Um, But I mean, how could I argue for that? It's sort of like, I guess, difference in personality, intuition, something
yes,
like that.
that for sure.
Mm.
And I think another thing about Vervaeke is that he seems like what I told you about his view of death beyond brain death, let's say, or the afterlife.
Yes,
I think he says things where you may think that he's a physicalist in a reductive sense, but he doesn't mean it like that a lot of the times. Like I think he does entertain a lot more than a lot of people realize is possible in reality. I just think he really stays away from that two worlds type of thing, and that makes him seem like he rejects any sort of, well, what we would call magic of some sorts. I think his whole thing is that it's right here.
yes,
He's trying to fall in love with being again, and he's trying to
yes,
help other people fall in love with being again. And once you do fall in love with being, you start to realize how enchanted it actually is. And so that's
yes,
where the absurd comes in the chaotic, but in a beautiful way.
yes, yeah.
And there's
I
something true
mean,
about it.
that's kind of, maybe I'll just I'll probably round off within the next 10 minutes or so, because I've
Yeah, my
probably got
wife's
to
been calling me a couple times. That would be good.
Oh yeah. Do you need to go now, or do you have
No,
about
we'll round it off
okay.
now. I think she's heading into work in like 30 minutes, so I think she's
Okay, cool,
what I'm
cool.
up to.
So what I've been really thinking about lately is Nietzsche. And so what you said just before kind of made me think of this, because Nietzsche is very much about this world. And 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 so maybe there's even some Nietzsche in Vervaeke. I think that I haven't heard Vervaeke talk about Nietzsche maybe at all. It seems like the one thinker that he wouldn't resonate too much with, but I could be wrong. But Nietzsche really also loathes the two-world hypothesis, you know? Um, and so he's all about immanence, and he's all about this
Yes,
world.
yes.
Um, and in a certain sense, the re-enchantment of this world. Um, he's a very interesting figure because again, he's got like all the, if you actually read his writing, he's very allegorical. He's very uses very strong and interesting language, kind of refers to mythology. Like he's not a very left brain person in that sense, but he's also very like dispenses with superstition, and you know, like
Yeah,
definitely doesn't believe in God. And so he's got a strong scientific left brain approach as well, and he combines them as well, really, I would say well, but very differently than Vervaeke, much more explosively, much more energetically. Maybe that's why I resonate with him, because he's, you know, there's more chaos, maybe more chaos in Nietzsche's world.
yeah.
Um, but I've been really thinking about him lately because it's sort of like, and I talked to Aaron about this too, because his thesis was on Nietzsche and Christianity. Nietzsche ends his last book that he wrote with the phrase or the question, um, Dionysus or the crucified. That are the people. Those are the two choices we have: Christianity or, for him, Dionysus, representing immanent, life-affirming way of being, which is the way that he's advocating. I think Aaron thinks it's a little less stark than just either or. That was kind of what his thesis was
Yeah.
arguing. I actually, having read a bit more of Nietzsche, or reread him recently, I think it actually is quite stark. I think he really is opposed to the Christian worldview, and not only the Christian worldview, but the post-Christian worldview as well. You talked about civilizational Christians and kind of new atheists kind of realizing that the civilizational Christians, and I think that that's because they are, and they always were. Our whole world still is conditioned by Christian assumptions and certainly Christian morality, right?
Sure, yeah.
Equality is essentially grown out of Christianity, the whole notion that we are intrinsically equal. Um, Perhaps you could argue that the whole idea of like a unitary self and an idea of a unitary cosmos, the one world, I guess you could say that that's grown out of Christianity as well. Um, but anyway, so back to Nietzsche. Nietzsche's really fascinating because he's consciously trying, and in a way desperately trying, to find an alternative worldview that's not conditioned by those Christian presuppositions. And partly to do this, he looks back to the ancient world, Greece and Rome. But he's not just about going back, like, you know, he embraces modern science, so he's also looking forward as well. And so what you get is a really interesting picture of everything is becoming, but everything is also will to power. There's a kind of vitalism that life is somehow not reducible to just the mechanics of molecules, but is kind of primary. There's a real sense of the enjoyment of life, the affirmation of life, but there's also a sense of its mystery, I would say, and enchantment. Um, I'm currently reading through Thus Spoke Zarathustra, which is this kind of magnum opus, you could say. Certainly in his view it is. It's kind of written in a biblical style, and it's kind of, I would say, his attempt to create a replacement scripture for Western humanity, or humanity itself, perhaps. So I'm currently reading through that with a commentary, and I hope to do some videos sort of with a commentary on that.
Cool. Yeah.
The commentator I'm reading, whose name is Lawrence Lampert,
Mm.
he argues that he actually did have this kind of positive attitude to religion as a kind of Dionysian religion. His idea was that the masses they couldn't be philosophers, and he didn't expect them to or want them to. So they'd have to have some kind of religion. Well, what would it look like? Well, it would be this Dionysian life-affirming religion. And so that's why he refers to Dionysus in his writings. So anyway, I guess I don't have anything definite to say about all this because I'm still thinking it all through, except to say that I guess my question would be, I guess, about the relationship that we have to Christianity in the West.
Yes.
Do we jettison it? Is where we are now a sort of more perfected version of it with the ideals that we have that are not sort of medieval Christian ideals, but sort of modern secular Christian ideals? Is that better? Do we go in a different path? What does it mean to affirm the world? And is that compatible with Christianity? I mean, those are all questions that I'm kind of wrestling with at the moment.
Oh, that's really good. I think it might be actually an idea to discuss that on the next episode, and I could possibly read Das Spoke Zarathustra, because I've been meaning to get into Nietzsche for my brother. And
yes.
then for this as well, it could be cool.
Perhaps we could talk with your brother as well.
Yeah, we could do a three part. That'll be fun. And then so what we could do is I could read that as homework. You've already read it, you say?
Yeah, I've read it. It's tricky because it's maybe not the one to start on.
I've read a bit of Nietzsche.
Yeah, okay, good. So you've got a basis because
yeah.
there's really Thus Spoke Zarathustra, and then there's everything else. And everything else is proper philosophy because he's actually, yeah, exactly. And then Thus Spoke Zarathustra is allegory, metaphor, story, myth. You have to kind of really figure out what he's actually
that's what I'm
talking
into right now. That I have much more hunger for that right now. So let's do that. I speak to Aaron, and then I'll keep you updated, and then I'll try to get something on the calendar. One question I do have: would you like to do your videos before we discuss that?
I hope to. I hope to. I'm sort of chipping away at it every day. But I have a full-time job, so I don't get much time.
I understand. We can put it in after that. Like, you can let us know when you're ready, and then I'll message Aaron and we'll set something up.
Yeah, it might be good to get the videos out first, I think, and then figure it out. Okay. So we've covered quite a few topics today.
Yeah, it's just all intuitive. I like it. It's good. I'll send you over the file, and I'm excited to see if people listen. I think it's quite a long one, no? 2 hours.
It is quite a long one. We'll have to kind of mark where the different topics are.
Yeah,
so
I'll do timestamps for this one. It'll be fun. But it's always a pleasure to talk to you, and so this is it's a little bit of a prelude for the next one, and I'm excited to do that. I think it's always fun to add Aaron's voice in it because he has more of that precision of the left hemisphere that I lack.
I've been longing to talk to him actually since we had our first talk, but I've also been thinking I don't want to do it before I've finished my little project on Nietzsche because I won't be, I won't be good enough. But yeah, I've definitely been keen to talk to him. And if there's any of your other listeners or people that you interact with that also want to have a chat with me, I'm definitely open for that as well. If anyone has any interesting topics they want to talk about.
Yeah, and reach out to people if you want. If you see a guest of mine, they're usually quite accessible because I got access.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you see someone interesting, it's a good idea. That sounds good. Then good luck with the projects and with the busyness, and then I'm really excited to speak again.
Awesome.
All right.
Thank you, Lucas.